Hello again. Thank you for joining us for our fourth Suffrage Centennial Book Club. My name is Regina Vitolo, and I'm a librarian at Lone Star College CyFair Library. Today we have Lone Star College CyFair History Professor Angela Bell joining us. She's been teaching at Lone Star College for over 11 years, and she has her PhD in history from the University of Missouri. Today, we will also have a guest presenter towards the end of our presentation, Lone Star College CyFair History Professor Bobby O'Brien, and he will be giving a short presentation on a women's suffrage historical site. So stay tuned for that. And we are going to go ahead and get started and turn the floor over to Dr. Angela Bell for her presentation. And then, Angela, you can let me know when to pull up your slides and advance them.
Okay, thank you so much. First of all, hello. How are you all today? I hope you're enjoying this fall cool front we've been having over the past few days. I'm really excited to be with you all today, and I want to thank Bobby O'Brien for suggesting that I lead this book discussion. The book that we are talking about today is One Person, No Vote: How Voter Suppression is Destroying Our Democracy by Dr. Carol Anderson. And some of you may know, some of you may not, but I have known Dr. Anderson since 1997. I took a class with her at the University of Missouri when I was an undergrad there. She was teaching a class called the Black Freedom Movement, and I was a social studies education major and needed several hours of American history and decided to take that class, looked through the course catalog, thought it sounded interesting, signed up. That must have been her second year at University of Missouri, and I was lucky enough to get into that class and take a semester-long class with her, upper level history course. She is one of the most talented historians I have ever met, and an incredibly generous and very gifted scholar. I had that class with her in undergrad, and then I decided to go on and do a master's in history after I graduated. And I distinctly remember I was at work and she came into the store and came up to me to say hi. And I told her at that time that I was going to pursue my master's. And she squealed in delight and gave me a very big hug and was very excited about it, which was really lovely. After I finished my master's, I went and taught high school for 2 years, and then I went back to get my PhD. And during that time, she was a professor again to me, and she sat in on a few classes where we read one of her books, one of her earlier books, and was able to give us insight into her process at that time too. So, and then as I was preparing for comprehensive exams, for those of you who have done that, you know it's exhausting and overwhelming. And she asked me how I was doing, and like everyone said, oh, I don't know what I'm doing and I'm not ready. And she just said, just read a book a day. That's all you've got to do. From now until you take your exams, just read a book a day. And that was about 180 days away. So you can imagine. What I'm trying to say is that she is incredibly supportive of other historians. And she is also able to be so supportive because she is just is really good at what she does. Some of you may have read her first book, White Rage. I happen to have it right here. That's the one that kind of put her onto the public stage, and then of course, One Person, No Vote, which we're looking at today. So Regina, if you will go ahead and pull up the presentation, and I will kind of walk us through that a little bit.
Okay. So one moment. Okay. Okay, is everyone able to see the presentation?
Yes, I can see it.
Perfect.
So Dr. Anderson now is the chair of African American Studies at Emory University in Atlanta, Georgia. She is in charge of that department, in charge of hiring, in charge of the classes that are presented, and she is a distinguished chair and has many other titles as well. But One of the things I think she is very, very good at doing, both in her teaching and in her writing, is she's very good at, I look like I'm a floating head. I'm going to put my camera down just a little bit. She's very good at looking at systemic issues. She's excellent at kind of saying, here's the issue, and then here's how you find out why that is an issue. And I think she does that in One Person, No Vote. Hopefully you were able to see that. Go ahead and advance the slide for me. Two years ago today, I went to the book festival in Austin. This popped up in my memories on Facebook today. But she was presenting at that book festival on her One Person, No Vote book. My friend Kristen Henze and I, who teaches with me at Lone Star, she and I went to the festival to hear Dr. Anderson speak. And Kristen was one of her PhD candidates. And so we met up with her afterwards, went out to dinner. We took her to Torchy's Tacos, because if you're in Texas, you need some tacos, obviously. And so 2 years ago today, we had that experience with her. I know it might be hard to see, but at the bottom of the caption that I have on the photos, the 3 photos, is one of the 5 most defining experiences of my life is taking the Black Freedom Movement class with Dr. Anderson, which is true. She was excited to see us, didn't know we were coming, and signed both of the books. You'll see on the right of the screen, on One Person, No Vote, she wrote, "We vote, we win!" exclamation point, which I think is a really interesting, what is it called? Epigraph? Is that what it's called? When somebody signs, whatever it's called, dedication, whatever it's called, which is kind of ironic reading the book, because the book is about how people are kept from voting. So I thought it was a kind of tongue-in-cheek signing for her, which I thought was fantastic. If you go on to the next slide, one of the things that people have asked before is, and actually Regina and I talked about this a little bit yesterday, if you have, One Person, No Vote is her 4th book, but it's really almost a second part to White Rage, which she wrote. It was published, it came out in 2016. And the reason she wrote that book, she was watching a couple of things. You can read about it at the beginning of the book if you'd like to. But one of the things that she talked about was turning her television on and seeing the protests in Ferguson, Missouri. As someone who lived and grew up in Missouri, went to the University of Missouri, as I did, and then someone like her who taught at the University of Missouri, Ferguson is a place that most people in the state know well. It is a suburb of St. Louis. It is just north of the airport in St. Louis, and it is very well known as being a Black suburb, but also one that the school districts are not the best in, and that has had a lot of racial unrest. So she wrote an op-ed in the that was published in the Washington Post on August 29th, 2014, and that event coincided with a number of other things she'd been thinking about for a while, and that was where the book White Rage came from. And so her headline is the thesis of her book. She talks about that the narrative that came out of the Ferguson protests were that African Americans were incredibly enraged against police, and were taking that rage out by burning the city in which they lived. And why in the world would they do that? And this isn't the right way to go about protesting, and so on and so forth. I'm sure you've heard that narrative many, many times if you've been paying attention to the news the past few years. And in her mind, that was very frustrating. And so her headline said, "It's not about white rage. It's not about Black rage. It's actually about white rage." And so she wrote then White Rage, that looks at the reaction of white America, which is rapidly becoming outnumbered and becoming a minority in the United States, and how there was an anger about that, an anger at the success of African Americans and other people of color, and how the white community then reacted against that success and attempted to then protect the white community from being outnumbered and being out progressed, if you will. That's not really the word, but that's the word I'll use for today. So that was where White Rage came from. While she was writing the book, she may have been in the, I'm not exactly sure of the timeline, but the next slide, you will see that was August 2014 that the Ferguson riots happened. The next year, in November of 2015, October, November, well, it started long before that. I'll give you the short version. At the University of Missouri, there was a protest by, in particular, African-American students. One African-American grad student went on a hunger strike, and that extended out through the rest of the student body and eventually made its way to the football team. And the football team went on strike. And when the football team went on strike, ESPN picked that story up and it became a national headline. And it's a much longer process than that. It started years before that. It actually started in 2012 when there was a new president hired. And at one point between 2012 and 2015, all of the deans had gone on strike. The faculty had gone on strike. The graduate students had gone on strike. The staff had gone on strike. And then the football team went on strike. So it was a process. But Dr. Anderson, who had been at Missouri from 1996 to 2008, you can see that at the bottom of the screen, wrote this article that was published in The Conversation, which I think, if I'm not mistaken, is through the library at the University of Missouri. It's still online. You can still read it. And she talked about her experience and at the university and the history of racism in Missouri and how that trickles down, which is part of both White Rage and One Person, No Vote, and looking at the kind of systemic issues that happen to suppress Black voters and other people of color who are trying to vote as well, the votes of people of color. So that's kind of the context of where White Rage comes from. And as she was writing White Rage, she got to the last chapter of the book and realized there was another story. And that story is what ends up becoming One Person, No Vote. So she looked at how if white America is enraged at the success of and the threat to the white community by the success of African Americans and other people of color, then how can those groups of people be marginalized, or how can they be removed from the equation so that they are not able to take away the America that white America is attempting to protect. And one of the best ways to do that is through voter suppression. Because if you are looking at the history of what's happening in the country, you can't say that it's racism. You can't say that we're going to suppress these people because they're Black, or they're Hispanic, or they are Asian, or they are whatever, insert group here. You can't say that you're going to do that outright, because then people say, oh, you're a racist. And things don't get done when people call you a racist for the most part. But if you say, well, it's because we're trying to protect something else, then that is an easier way, or a more socially acceptable way of getting things done. So I'm going to give you a little bit of, I hope that was helpful in understanding where the books come from, and also a little bit about her and how I am aware of her work. But I'm going to go ahead and give you, if you'll advance to the next slide, I think, without, oh, I have another slide in there. So these are 3 of her 4 or 5 books. The first one that she wrote is the one that I read in grad school, which is about the Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. And then she wrote one about the Black middle class. And then she wrote White Rage, and then One Person, No Vote. I believe the We Are Not Yet Equal is a compilation. She was an editor of that. So those are 3 of the 5 books that she has out now. Okay, if you'll go to the next one. I have for you a very brief and very incomplete timeline of suffrage and voter suppression events. I will hit the highlights here just because there's just too much, and I don't want to spend the entire time just giving you a history lesson, but I will go through briefly what's going on. And Regina, if you'll just click as I'm talking, that would be fine. The first event that I have on here is the Civil War ends, the Confederacy is defeated, depending on who you are in this country. But the Civil War did end, and the Union did win, and the Confederacy was defeated. Around April, May 1865, depending on which army you're talking about surrendering. The kind of official date is April 1865, but there were other groups that continued fighting. I just tried to advance that myself. Sorry, habit. The next kind of major event is the 13th Amendment, ratified in 1865, same year that the Civil War ends. That is the amendment that ends slavery. No person can be enslaved as a punishment, except for punishment of a crime, which has been a thing, but it officially ends slavery in the United States. In the 14th Amendment, after that, I have the Ku Klux Klan is founded in 1865 in response to the perhaps problem that is going to happen because of the freed slaves. Radical Reconstruction begins about the same time, 1866, 1867. Radical Reconstruction is when the radical Republicans in Congress take over for Johnson, who is the president, and they don't think he's being harsh enough and mean enough to the South. So they take over. And also because, honestly, the rights of freed slaves are not being, they're not happening. The 14th Amendment is then ratified in 68. That grants citizenship and due process of law to all citizens, all persons born in the United States. And then after that, we have the 15th Amendment is ratified in 1870. The 15th Amendment grants the right to vote to all men, male citizens. After that, we have, I don't even know, redemption beginning in 1877. That is the end of Radical Reconstruction, the end of Reconstruction in the South. And that is when the North pulls out of the South, and Southern Democrats, white Southern Democrats, are able to take control of the governments in the South, and for all intents and purposes allows the South to eradicate all of the rights given to African Americans following the Civil War. This is when the Jim Crow laws really become firmly entrenched: poll taxes, literacy tests, grandfather clause. United Daughters of the Confederacy is founded in 1894. That is a full 30 years after the war has ended. I teach my students that this was founded specifically, there were many reasons, but specifically because following the Civil War, or the generation that was born following the Civil War, did not know what it was like to live under slavery. They did not know what it was like to live under the Confederacy. And the United Daughters of the Confederacy launched an education program to let people know what living in the South was really like, and that the slaves were happy, and that the Civil War was really something that should not have happened. Plessy versus Ferguson, the court case that establishes the separate but equal doctrine, is handed down in 1896. And then the NAACP is founded in 1909. The NAACP then attempts to work towards creating equality, integrating African Americans into society, desegregating society, usually through the courts and by attacking legal situations or laws that are in place. A few years later, the 19th Amendment happens in 1920. And what happens in between 1909 and 1920, there are many things that are happening, but in particular for African Americans, World War I occurs. And during World War I, African American soldiers are sent to Europe, and they experience a very different culture and have fought for their country, seen a different culture, come home and attempt to gain more rights. That is happening right as women are attempting to gain the right to vote. And we've, in the past book clubs, if you have come to those since we've started those in the last few months, we talked about how the 19th Amendment, while it gives women the right to vote, it does not, in fact, give African American women the right to vote, not because they're not included, but because Jim Crow laws, poll taxes, literacy tests, other what are those called? Jim Crow laws. I'm sorry, my brain just went away. Jim Crow laws are in place that prohibit women, African American women, from voting. Okay, if you go on to the next slide, that is up to the 19th Amendment. After that, we have several cases that are connected to education. One of the first is Gaines versus Missouri in 1939. I bring that up partly because that's where I'm from and I know about it, but also what happens, the short version is that there's an African American man, last name of Gaines, who applies to the University of Missouri, is denied admission and sues on the basis that there is no separate but equal facility. There is only one law school in Missouri, and it's at the University of Missouri. And he is, through a long process, eventually is able to enroll, wins the case, and is able to enroll. Well, he wins the case in that the state is going to have to either allow him into the university, which they do not do, or pay for him to go out of state to another university. What happens, though, is that Gaines disappears, is most likely lynched, and is never able to attend. When I was at the University of Missouri during my PhD, I think it was 2003 or 4, I can't remember, maybe 5. I was at the Arts and Science graduation, College of Arts and Science graduation. One of my friends was graduating. I went to see him, and there was an honorary PhD granted to Gaines at that commencement. In 1948, after World War II, again, World War II allows for African Americans to enlist in the military, also drafted into the military, and sent to Europe and come home with a renewed sense of, we fought for this country, we've seen a different culture, we know this could be different. And in 1948, the United Nations is attempting to create or to write the Declaration of Human Rights. And during that process, which is what Dr. Anderson's first book is about, the NAACP writes a letter called An Appeal to the World and presents it to Eleanor Roosevelt and asks her, she's the United States, the United States delegation to the United Nations, and also happens to be on the board that is writing the Declaration on Human Rights. They ask her to read it, and she says no. She says no because she thinks that if An Appeal to the World is read, which is a document that basically says that race needs to be considered if you're looking at human rights, then race needs to be considered in order to allow for the different experiences different races are having in the world. And she declines, let's put it that way. She declines to read it because she is afraid that it will make the United States look bad in the eyes of the world. And we can't look bad, because if we look bad, then we'll lose the Cold War and the Soviets will win. So there is a very interesting connection between the Civil War, or the Cold War, and civil rights, and how those are connected is the basis of many, many, many works. In 1954, Brown versus Board, which is also known as Board 1, is decided. That is the court case, which I'm sure you know, overturns Plessy versus Ferguson. It says that separation, separate but equal, is fundamentally unequal. That there is no way to be equal if there is separation. It's followed the next year by Brown 2. Most people don't know about Brown 2, but that's supposed to say 1955. Sorry, that's a typo. Brown 2 is in 1955, and in that decision, it lays out the time frame for desegregation of schools. Brown 1 says to desegregate. Brown 2 says we need to desegregate with all deliberate speed. The South responds in the Southern Manifesto in 1956 and says, first of all, that with all deliberate speed is a very interesting interpretation depending on where you are in the country. And some places that happens very quickly, and some places that does not happen quickly at all. The Southern Manifesto not only says we don't really want to desegregate, but it says that that the United States does not have the right, the Supreme Court does not have the right to rule on Brown versus Board or Brown 2, because education is not written into the Constitution, and therefore, according to the 10th Amendment, should be left up to the states. Because it should be left up to the states, the Supreme Court does not have the authority to rule on Brown versus Board. And so school desegregation is, in fact, not valid, according to the Southern Manifesto. Following basically from 1955 through 1969, well, there's a Black freedom movement that occurs. It lasts for a while. I would argue that the dates are very, very fluid. But if you take a class on it, a lot of people are going to say 56 to 69. You have the Montgomery bus boycott. You have the lynching of Emmett Till, which is in 1955. Little Rock, Birmingham. I mean, all of these things that if you know anything about the Black freedom movement, you've heard of at least a couple of those. The I Have a Dream speech. So by the time we get to 1965, we have an event known, I'll just go on and I'll come back, an event known as Bloody Sunday, which happens in Selma, Alabama in March of 1965. The year before that, in 1964, the 24th Amendment to the Constitution is ratified. It eliminates poll taxes and nationally. And then in 1966, the Supreme Court hands down a decision that eliminates poll taxes at the state level as well. And Bloody Sunday in Selma, of course, you have the protesters marching across Edmund Pettus Bridge and then being met by the Alabama State Troopers and beaten. And then the next day, Johnson, the President of the United States, says, we need to do something about this. Again, we're in the middle of the Cold War. We don't want the Soviets to win. The Vietnam conflict is going on at this point. And so by August of 1965, you have the Voting Rights Act that is passed that bans the use of literacy tests. The poll taxes are already done away with, according to the 24th Amendment. It also provides federal oversight of voter registration in areas where I copied and pasted this off of that, so this is real. In areas where less than 50% of the non-white population had not registered to vote, and it authorized the U.S. Attorney General to investigate the use of poll taxes in state and local elections, and then the next year, the Supreme Court gets rid of those. Which brings us to the book. If you if you have read it, I hope you were able to. If not, I would suggest doing it at some point. But if you haven't, you are, I'm sure, still able to follow along. The first chapter is about how then the Voting Rights Act is put into place and how over the next, until 2013, it is chipped away at, and how the states where the federal government is overseeing voter registration, where 50% or fewer of African Americans or minorities are able to register, have been registered, how that is chipped away at until we get to 2013 and we get the Supreme Court case that then says we don't need federal oversight anymore because racism doesn't really exist anymore. We elected a black president in 2008. We reelected him in 2012. And so we don't need federal oversight anymore. And so when that happens in 2013, immediately then states start passing these laws that will then overturn the Voting Rights Act and start voter suppression up in ways that had not been allowed legally while the Voting Rights Act was the supreme law. So that's what the first chapter does. She looks at that, and it is a study of systemic racism. It is a study between how you do things systemically and how you do things overtly. And she does it really, really well. Chapters 2 through 3, or 2 through 4, I'm sorry, 2, 3, and 4 look at specific ways that is done. So in chapter 2, she looks at the voter ID laws. As we are getting ready to do election day next Tuesday, we've already been voting in Texas for 2 weeks at this point. Is it 2 weeks? Yeah, 2.5 weeks at this point. So we're already doing that. We know that there is a voter ID law in Texas. And she looks at kind of and other states, obviously, but one of the ways in Texas that I don't remember if she talks about it in the book, but she does talk about it in lectures that she's given on this, and talks about ways that in particular people of color are not able to get the correct IDs, the accepted IDs. And it depends on by state what kind of IDs are accepted. So people of color tend to be the poor tend to not have by percentage as many driver's licenses, and those are accepted. In Texas, one of the accepted voter IDs is a hunting license, which is disproportionately white. And one of the types of voter IDs that are not accepted is a student ID, which is disproportionately young, and younger voters tend to vote Democrat. So she talks about different ways that voter ID is used to suppress the vote. Chapter 3 looks at the voter roll purge, and it looks at how the different states have created, and the Republican Party, the overall Republican Party, has looked at ways to purge voters from the rolls. And then we look at Chapter 4, which is rigging the rules, and that looks at kind of closing down DMVs and looking at all sorts of other add all the other types of voter suppression you could think of and put it in that chapter. And then Chapter 5 is called The Resistance. I think it's supposed to be uplifting. It's not as much as it maybe. This book is really depressing in some ways and very, but it looks at how in Alabama in 2017, the Alabama special election in December of 2017, how the Democrats got out to vote, and in fact went above and beyond and were able to kind of circumvent all these attempts at voter suppression. And she ends the chapter by saying, well, they were able to do this, but they shouldn't have to, because none of these hoops that they had to jump should be legal for citizens of the United States who are, in fact, supposed to be registered to vote. In the conclusion, she looks at kind of what in the world how in the world can we go forward from here? She does this with By Rage too. She looks at kind of what America could be if we had not my kitten has decided to say hello. If we had not invested all this time and energy trying to figure out how to suppress the vote, she says hi, and instead had invested the money that had been used to do that in making the world and the country better. That in fact, voter suppression does not just harm people of color, it harms the entire country and it harms democracy in general. And America is supposed to be, of course, the beacon of democracy. And so by suppressing the vote and by harming our democracy, we're not just harming African Americans and other people of color, but we're harming the entire nation and our entire system. So that's kind of the arc of what she's done. And I don't know if any of you have questions or if you have comments. I would love to hear them. And then Bobby, I think, is going to have some more information for us too.
Yes, if you have any questions, please feel free to type them in the Q&A box or in the chat box to everyone, and I can relay them to Angela. I'm gonna go ahead and start with one question. Can you briefly expand on the connection between Cold War and the Civil Rights era?
Sure. First of all, I feel like I talked really fast. So sorry if I was talking so fast and people missed stuff. Feel free to ask for clarification. I have no problem with that. The kind of argument that is made about the Cold War and civil rights, there are kind of two different camps. One of them is, or at least there were when I was in grad school. This may have expanded since then. I've kept up, but you always learn more in grad school than you do anywhere else. But there was a book called Cold War Civil Rights that came out. Mary Dudziak, I think, is the author of that. And the argument that she made was that because the United States was so worried about losing the Cold War to the Soviet Union, the argument was that the United States then advanced African American rights. So the argument is that, or the idea is that the United States is supposed to be a democracy. It's supposed to allow for freedom. It's supposed to allow for individual liberty. It's supposed to allow for all of those things. And as these, so for instance, after World War II, African-American soldiers come home from the war, and there is a kind of a rash of beatings and lynchings of African-American soldiers. One in particular was his eyes were gouged out, so he was blinded. There were others that were lynched in their uniforms. There's all sorts of problems where African-American veterans in the South, in particular, it's happening all over, but in particular in the South, are being lynched. And that makes the news, as you can imagine. And not only does it make the news here, it makes the news internationally. And so the Soviet Union is then able to hold that up, among other things, but hold that up. My kitten really is going crazy because I'm moving my hands here. And to say, hey, people who happen to be of African descent, if you live in Africa, and there is this kind of collapse of European empires after World War II because they're fighting the Nazis, they don't have time to deal with their empires. So all these countries in Africa and in Southeast Asia and in the Middle East are then losing the imperial powers are pulling out. And so they are then, what do we do with our government? Can we be independent? We would like to be independent, or so on and so forth. And so countries in particular in sub-Saharan Africa are experiencing a vacuum of power, and they're then having to create their own governments. And so the Soviet Union is saying, well, you don't want to follow them because they're killing their own Black people. Why in the world would you want to possibly follow them? And so you should, in fact, turn communist and follow us. And so Cold War Civil Rights argues that because of that threat, the United States then advances in civil rights legislation and decisions. So that's why you have some of these advancements that happen in the 1950s and the 1960s, in particular after the launch of Sputnik in 57. So it's in 57 that you have Brown versus Board in 54, and then the Montgomery bus boycott in 56, and then Sputnik in 57. And then after that, you have the election of JFK, and then all these kind of breaking down of the legal laws, the legal laws, of course, it's a legal law, the laws that are in place that segregate. So those are done away with. The argument that Dr. Anderson makes in her first book, Eyes Off the Prize, which is the book about the appeal to the world and the Declaration of Human Rights, she argues that, in fact, the Cold War does not necessarily help African Americans, because you have somebody like Eleanor Roosevelt who says, I can't read that, because if I read that, then people will know that we're not treating Black people right. And then people will go off to the side of the Soviet Union. So Cold War Civil Rights argues that the U.S. government actually advances the rights of African Americans. And the other camp argues, no, they don't. They don't necessarily do that. They may kind of give it lip service, but they don't really actually end racism or discrimination.
Okay, great. So we have a comment and a question.
Excellent.
Okay, so after the 19th Amendment and women gained the right to vote, it took another 70 to 80 years to enfranchise all Black Americans. In regards to the current suppression, how do we avoid another lengthy battle?
Oh, that's a good question.
So maybe if you can just touch on the 2013 Shelby ruling and then answer that part of the question.
Yeah, I think the short answer is we vote. I mean, really, those of us who are not being suppressed, we vote with the intention to, or the understanding that there are people who can't, and we need to vote with them in mind. That's the short answer. But yeah, the court case in 2013, which then basically overturns part of or retracts, if you will, part of the Voting Rights Act. What's happened is in 2016, the argument of one person, no vote, is that, the after the 2016 election, the argument was that Hillary Clinton didn't turn out the Black vote, that she just didn't excite them, and so they stayed home. The African American community did not help her get elected. And the argument of her book, of Dr. Anderson's book, is that they couldn't turn. Some of them chose not to vote, but some of them chose not to vote because there was a targeted social media campaign to convince them not to vote. That they actually had more power by not voting, and so people chose to stay home. And so there were also people who tried to vote and could not because they'd been purged, because they didn't have the right voter ID, because polling places were closed, because early voting was restricted, because so on and so forth. And so what's been happening since then is that there have been a number of grassroots organizations that have worked to make sure that people are registered to vote, that there's been several campaigns that have suggested over and over and over, I've seen these on social media all the time, make sure that not only are you registered to vote, but also check and make sure your voting registration is still valid. Make sure that you are taking people to the polls. Make sure that you are, doing whatever you can to make a voting plan. That's the big one this year. Make a voting plan. What's your plan? So there is this kind of process where there's a grassroots organization to get people to the polls. And not only that, but when they get there, if they have been purged, if they don't have the right ID, then to contact one of the resources that actually works to say, no, that's not true, or here's what happened. So they have, there are organizations that are in place that are working to counteract these attempts to voter suppression. There are also a number of court cases that have happened to attack certain laws in specific states. She talks about several of those in the book. But I think in general, the way in order to avoid another 7 to 80 years of this, I think there has to be an awareness that it's happening, which is the rhetoric that is being thrown out is we're gonna make sure that there's not voter fraud, and we're going to do that by making sure that we purge the ballots or purge the voting rolls. We're going to do all these things to make sure that the vote is secure and that it's accurate. And what that does is, of course, suppress votes. So the first thing is to be aware that it's happening, to not buy into the language that is being used, and then to do what we can individually to counteract that by helping others get to the polls, by voting ourselves, by whatever it is that we can do. Some of us don't have the opportunity to drive people to the polls. Some of us don't have the opportunity to do whatever, but we can do something. And so to be aware that it's happening, to intentionally not buy in to the language that is being used to try to convince people that voter suppression isn't a problem, and then to vote and to help others do the same. I hope that was where you were wanting me to go with that, or where I hope that I answered the question.
That was a great answer. And I mean, of course, information literacy is vital during something like this. And knowing that you have resources like the CyFair Library's LibGuide for voter information and harrisvotes.com, you can always visit that. And another great website to visit is the League of Women Voters. And you can go and educate yourself on all of the candidates, and then find the closest polling location near you. And on Harris Votes, you can even go online, enter your location, and find out the wait times for all of the polls around you. And I do want to mention that on October 29th, as of yesterday, there are going to be 8 24-hour voting locations. So remember that. If you're one of those people who has waited to the last minute, you have 24 hours on starting October 29th. Go ahead, Angela.
Well, first of all, I will say that as a night owl, I wanted to wait for the 24-hour voting so I could do it at 2:00 in the morning. I was just like, that would be so cool. And my friends were like, no, we're going early. So I've already voted. But I just wanted to say also that Harris County's been doing it. I mean, we've over 1 million votes in Harris County already. So that's pretty exciting. So hopefully that can be a counteract to it. Also, by the way, in this book, there is, after the conclusion, there is a section that provides resources as well. So if you are looking for links, and specific links, anything that she just said, and also a lot of other ones, but there are links, well, they're not links because it's, print, but you know what I mean? There are URLs that you can go to.
Well, fantastic. That was so informative, and thank you for giving us that timeline and going through all of the important steps leading up to where we are now with voter suppression and voting rights. Before we turn the floor over to Bobby for his brief presentation, I just want to let everyone know that the third and fourth volume of the Suffrage Centennial newsletter will be sent out by the end of the week, and it will include the link to this presentation and our past presentations, and it will also include a write-up from Angela and the photos and the essay that Bobby is going to discuss here in the presentation. So keep an eye out for that in your inbox. And also, we will have a link up shortly for our November Suffrage Centennial Book Club, and that will also be included in the newsletter. All right, I'm going to go ahead and pull up Bobby's presentation, and I'm going to see here if I can make him a panelist. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and unmute Bobby here. And Bobby, I'm pulling up your presentation. I'll share my screen, and then you can tell me when to advance the slides.
Okay.
Okay, one moment.
Just want to say thank you to Angela for that informative presentation. And you're right that the book is depressing. And she puts everything together. It's it's hard to find some uplifting stuff. Although the chief from Alabama is very good. She shows the resistance. Okay. I used to live in Tennessee. I went to college in Clarksville, Tennessee, which is about 40 miles northwest of Nashville. And in the last 10 years or so, I've been back to Tennessee several times. And one of the times I went to the, my wife and I stayed at the Hermitage, which is the hotel that many of the suffrage leaders and anti-suffrage leaders stayed at in 1920 when the battle was going on in Tennessee for voting for the 19th Amendment. If you could go to the first slide, or next slide, I'm sorry. Okay, there's the Hermitage Hotel. It's a beautiful building, built in 1910, so it was still relatively new when the suffrage vote was going on in 1920. And in the background, you can see the Capitol building. So it was only a few blocks away, but I'm not sure if you can tell. It's actually up a hill. So it's in the middle of the summer. People wear clothes that are much heavier back then. So I think in Elaine Weiss's book, she talks some about there's people sweating a lot, not just about the vote, but also literally because it was so hot. And it's not a long walk, but it's up a hill. And the building itself is beautiful. It was getting in disrepair in the late 20th century, and then in the 1980s and 1990s, there were several different renovations done. At one point, they thought it was maybe going to be closed, but they were able to renovate it. And in the 90s was the first time we stayed in it. And then we stayed again, and I think in 2012. If you could go to the next slide. That's actually my wife. That's when we were there in 2012. And that's the lobby. And I'm showing a picture of the lobby because the lobby became like an unofficial meeting place for suffrage leaders and different politicians, and also anti-suffrage leaders and their allies. So there must have been some interesting gatherings in this lobby. Yeah, next slide. And this is the other thing it's known for, maybe known for more, and it's kind of detrimental, I guess, to the women's right, is they're known for their men's room, which was designed, I think, in the 2030s with this Art Deco green design. And the men's room's been used in music videos and for other films too. If you go to the next slide, you'll see an actual picture from and it's not a very good photo, but it's actually chairs. It's like a area in the men's room. Okay, next slide. And then this past summer, happened to be in Tennessee again. We were staying outside of Nashville. It wasn't planned, but we ended up being there on the actual date that the 19th Amendment was ratified, that the Tennessee State House did it on August 18th, 1920. So I was there on August 18th, 2020. And I know a lot of events have been canceled or modified because of the pandemic, and things were being done virtually, but I decided I just got in the car and drove by myself and went to Centennial Park, where I knew they had a suffrage statue of 5 of the suffrage leaders. And it's hard to see them because I couldn't get close, is the five of the leaders, 3 or 4 of them are from Tennessee, and up front is Carrie Chapman Catt. The women from Tennessee are Ann Dallas Dudley, Abby Milton, Sue White, who was part of the National Women's Party, who worked with Alice Paul, but she was also from Tennessee, and also J. Frankie Pierce, who was an African-American educator and didn't participate in the meetings, didn't belong to the organizations, but was actually invited to speak before Tennessee suffrage group several months before the vote. And it was this when I went to the Centennial Park, they were having a ceremony. And unfortunately, you could not get very close. And if you look at this photo, you can see the area looks like it's trashed. And they were actually doing renovations to the whole park. And I found it disappointing because they knew this event was coming up. I mean, they had started planning for it, 3 or 4 years earlier, knowing the 100-year anniversary, but they did not get these renovations done, the landscaping to the park. And this ceremony was also, they were moving the statues. They had been in another part of the park, and they were moving them closer to the main part of the park. Okay, next slide. And here you could, this is about as close as I could get. You can see there's very few people. It was only probably about 20 people watching and maybe about 20 participating. And we had to stand behind a chain link fence, and you could see all the construction that was going on. Well, the event itself was interesting. They had descendants of some suffrage leaders, some of the politicians, Governor Roberts, who had been the governor of Tennessee in 1920. There was a descendant of his that gave a speech. So it was the event itself was interesting, but you just couldn't get very close. Next slide. And here I got a little closer, and you could see this is towards the end of the event. Some of the women speakers were dressed in dresses resembled the period and had banners from the suffrage period. And right at the moment that the vote was cast 100 years ago, a bell ringing, because bell ringings went on after the vote passed around the country. So they rang a bell for a couple minutes. Okay, next slide. Some of the people attending, the two women on the left and right, the two older women, were from Clarksville, the town I used to live in. And several days before this, they had actually took part in a ceremony for a statue in Clarksville, just a generic statue of women's suffrage. And they had actually asked to help with the Nashville statue, but they were turned down. And it took me back to the days when Nashville sometimes be a little snobbish towards the outlying town. So the women were a little disappointed, but still wanted to come to watch this ceremony. And then the young woman in the center is actually the great-granddaughter of Anne Dallas Dudley, one of the suffrage leaders who's in the statue. And she was excited to be there, and she was taking bunches of pictures. Okay, next slide. And this is actually the park that it's in. To the left of the building is where the statues now are. And the building probably looks familiar. It's a replica of the Parthenon in Greece. And this was built in 1897 to celebrate the 100-year anniversary of Tennessee's statehood from 1797. And if you're not familiar with Nashville, their nickname going back to the 19th century has been the Athens of the South, because they always had a lot of colleges. They still to this day have a lot of small, many of them religious affiliated colleges. Of course, Vanderbilt University, which is probably about 5-10 minutes away from this, is probably the most famous university from Nashville. But it's an exact replica. And I've never been inside it. I've only been around it. I've been to this park a lot, but I've never been inside the building. And that's the last slide. That's all I have to say. And I guess the last thing I'll say is go out and vote. I haven't done it yet. And thank you, Regina, and thank you, Angela.
Thank you both so much for joining us today for our 4th Suffrage Centennial Book Club. Again, as Angela and Bobby already plugged, go and vote. Do not wait until the last minute. If you have an opportunity to go and vote, or if you want to take advantage of the 24-hour poll locations on October 29th. And if you feel like snapping a photo of yourself after you voted with your I voted sticker, go ahead and post it on social media and tag us, LSC-CyFair Library. And you can use the tag My Voice, My Vote, CYF, and we will share your photo on our social media feeds. And again, I just want to remind everyone, newsletter, which was delayed, will be sent to you soon, and links to our previous presentations and our voter resources will be included in that newsletter. But again, thank you all for hanging around and sticking with us to the end of our presentation. And we hope to see you for our next Suffrage Centennial Book Club in November, on November 17th. And information about that meeting will be coming your way soon as well. Everyone, enjoy the rest of your week. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.